There is something written inside you, not a metaphor, a biological inscription buried in 2 to 3% of your genome if your ancestry traces back outside of Africa. It doesn't code for memory or language, but it may have coded for something that mattered more than either: survival. Somewhere in deep prehistory, two kinds of human looked at each other across a fire, and one of them did not look away. That encounter is now readable in bone fragments from Croatian caves, in a tooth from a Siberian hillside, in sediment where DNA has been sleeping for 40,000 years. But here's what the data quietly reveals, and what most people never hear. Not everyone made contact. Some populations passed through the same ice ages, breathed the same post-glacial darkness, and their genomes read clean. No Neanderthal signal. None. Not because they were more advanced, but because of something far more fragile: geography, timing, and the invisible architecture of who found whom in the dark. The populations who never made contact, those are the ones whose story may be the most unsettling of all. Because in the Ice Age, isolation was rarely freedom. Usually, it was a countdown. Tell us where you're watching from tonight, and what do you think kept early humans alive more than anything else? Strength, intelligence, or something no one talks about? For most of the 20th century, the word chosen for Neanderthals was replaced. Clean, clinical, implying that modern humans arrived in Europe and Neanderthals simply failed to compete, that the outcome was inevitable, that superiority had decided it. Then, in 2010, that story cracked open. Svante Pääbo's team published the first Neanderthal genome from bone fragments sitting in a Croatian museum for decades. When they compared it against living human DNA from around the world, they found something the replacement model could not absorb. People from Europe, Asia, Oceania, the Americas, they all shared between 1 and 4% of their genome with Neanderthals. Sub-Saharan Africans did not. That asymmetry was the first hard signal. The interbreeding hadn't happened inside Africa. It had happened after some populations crossed out in a corridor that ancient genome studies now narrow to a window of roughly 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. In geological time, barely a breath. But here's what that asymmetry also revealed. The boundary between those who mixed and those who didn't was not a wall of biology. It was a boundary of movement, of who crossed and when, and where their descendants went after. The Neanderthals weren't just victims of replacement. They were part of a contact system, fragile, intermittent, and far stranger than anyone had imagined. Picture a woman carrying a child across a frozen valley. She doesn't know she's part of an out-of-Africa migration. She doesn't know her group number's fewer than 200. She knows the wind direction, the last water source, the direction the herd moved 3 days ago. And somewhere across the valley, behind a ridgeline, there is smoke from a fire her people did not make. This is what contact looked like. Not diplomacy, not war. A thin column of smoke, footprints crossing a frozen river, a tool carved in a style no one in her group has seen before. Sub-Saharan African populations carry the clearest genetic lineage to the original Homo sapiens, not because their ancestors were isolated, but because they were elsewhere, connected to a different landscape that never intersected with the contact corridor. For decades, scientists used African genomes as the assumed zero when measuring Neanderthal admixture in others. But in 2020, a Princeton team discovered something unexpected. African populations carry a faint Neanderthal trace after all. Not from direct contact, no Neanderthal fossil has ever been found in Africa, but from a back migration, people who had interbred with Neanderthals in Eurasia then returned, carrying that signal home like a letter delivered to the wrong address. That should not have happened, but it did, which means the system was never as clean as the maps suggested. 2% sounds small, but for 2% to appear in every non-African human alive today, from Scandinavia to New Guinea, the original interbreeding had to happen in a single founding population before the split that sent one branch west and another east across Eurasia. One contact event, one window, one population small enough that a single season of reproductive exchange could alter every human genome born outside Africa for the next 45 millennia. And here is what most people never hear about the Neanderthal fragments that survived inside us. They are not a random sample, they are filtered. Across modern genomes, large regions, especially around genes governing male fertility, carry almost no Neanderthal ancestry at all. Those segments were selected out over thousands of generations because hybrid combinations there reduced reproductive success. What we carry today is the residue of a larger initial mixing that biology quietly edited down. The 2% is what was allowed to stay. The populations who never entered the contact zone were spared this filtering. But they were also spared what came with it: immune variants, cold climate adaptations, physiological tools built into Neanderthal DNA across 200,000 years of Ice Age survival. Every contact left something. Every non-contact left a different kind of something. Now stop and consider what the genetic record is actually showing us beneath the admixture percentages. At multiple points in human prehistory, our entire species came within statistical reach of disappearing entirely, and we have no record of how many times it almost happened. The founding population that crossed out of Africa and eventually gave rise to all non-African humanity may have been so small that a single harsh winter, a single failed migration, a single outbreak of disease across one vulnerable group could have ended the entire lineage before it ever reached Eurasia, before it ever met a Neanderthal, before any of us existed. There were almost certainly other groups who tried the crossing before them. Human remains older than 50,000 years have been found outside Africa. They left no descendants detectable in anyone alive today. They crossed. They survived for a time. They vanished completely absorbed, outcompeted, or simply reduced below the threshold of demographic recovery before the contact systems could reach them. And the groups who never made contact with Neanderthals, who remained within Africa, or moved through corridors that bypassed the Eurasian network, they faced their own version of this countdown. Drought cycles that compressed entire populations into fragmented refugia. Generations where a group of 40 people might go years without encountering another human band. Where a sick elder meant the loss of irreplaceable navigational memory. Where the birth of too few daughters meant a lineage simply stopped. We find their tools sometimes, beautifully made, sophisticated, evidence of minds fully as capable as ours, but no DNA, no descendants, no continuation. The horror of the prehistoric record is not the predators or the cold. It is the silence surrounding the survivors, the vast, unmarked absence of all the human groups who almost made it and didn't, who lived full lives, held their children, remembered their dead, and left nothing behind that the world could keep. Humanity almost failed, repeatedly and quietly, and we have no idea how close the margin actually was. Then comes the uncomfortable truth about why Neanderthals disappeared. They endured Eurasian climates for over 200,000 years. They hunted megafauna, manufactured compound adhesives, cared for injured individuals who could not have survived without help. Their disappearance was not the failure of weak individuals. It was the failure of a network. In their final millennia, Neanderthal populations across Europe and Western Asia may have numbered as few as 1,000 to 3,000 total individuals. The Altai Neanderthal genome from a single person recovered in Siberia carries an inbreeding coefficient, suggesting her parents were as closely related as half-siblings. That is not an outlier. That is a system that has already lost most of its internal connectivity. The Neanderthals did not vanish in a moment. Their network vanished first. Shrinking mate exchange systems. Migration corridors cut off by climate instability, birth rates unable to compensate for local extinctions. A cascade failure already in motion before the first modern humans set foot in Europe. The modern humans who moved into that collapsing system were not biologically superior. They were, in a system sense, less fragile, more connected, more mobile. more capable of absorbing shock without fragmenting completely. Most humans did not survive because they were stronger. They survived because someone found someone else. Here is the thing that changes the shape of the entire story. The humans who left Africa, the ones who eventually met Neanderthals and whose descendants carry that signal today, they did not leave because they were bold, or curious, or destined. They left because they were desperate. Nobody crossed the Sinai for adventure. Nobody pushed north into glacial Europe for ambition. Population movement in the deep past was driven by the quiet arithmetic of too many individuals and too little food at the territorial margins. Drought cycles, compressing habitable zones, a group positioned at the geographic frontier with no viable path backward. And here is where the existential weight of this story becomes undeniable. The populations that crossed the ones whose descendants carry Neanderthal DNA, the ones from whom most of the world's population descends, were not the best of humanity. They were not the most capable, or the most intelligent, or the most deserving of survival. They were the ones who happened to be standing at the edge when the edge collapsed. The populations who never made Neanderthal contact weren't protected by superiority either. They survived because the landscape they were embedded in held together a little longer. Because the rains came. Because the corridor didn't close. Because 40,000 years ago, the accident of geography meant their network didn't have to fracture in the same way. Survival was never about quality, it was about coordinates. And that realization, once it settles, makes every human achievement look both more remarkable and more precarious than we usually allow ourselves to believe. And here is where the data becomes genuinely unsettling. Some researchers now ask whether the Neanderthal signal itself may be partially a ghost. A 2024 paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution proposed that statistical methods used to detect Neanderthal admixture may produce false positives when ancient population structure within Africa is ignored. The researchers simulated human evolution without any admixture event, and the software still found Neanderthal fragments, the ghost of interbreeding, summoned by structure alone. Most specialists argue the long, intact Neanderthal DNA segments in modern genomes are too coherent to be explained this way. Real gene flow, they contend, is the more parsimonious answer. But the debate points to something deeper. The further back we push, the more the record resists clean reading. We are not reading history. We are reading a palimpsest text written over text by populations who left no record of their complexity except in the molecular residue of their descendants. Maybe the signal itself is haunted. Maybe what we're calling Neanderthal ancestry is partly the echo of a much older separation populations within Africa, diverging and reuniting over hundreds of thousands of years, leaving traces so ancient they blur into something that looks like a different species. We don't know, and that uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is what the system actually looks like when you try to read it from 40,000 years away. Stand back from the populations. Look at the system as a whole. What ancient DNA is constructing slowly, genome by genome, is not a family tree. It is a map of connectivity. The invisible infrastructure of contact, migration, and reproductive exchange that determined which groups maintained enough diversity to adapt and which contracted until recovery became impossible. The populations that mixed with Neanderthals were not the most advanced. They were the most connected, embedded, and active migration systems that kept them linked to new genetic variation even as they moved through unknown territory. The populations with no Neanderthal signal survived through a different connectivity, large, stable, internally diverse networks that never needed to reach into Eurasian space to maintain biological resilience. Both systems worked. For a time, what neither system could guarantee was permanence. The prehistoric world was not full of civilizations. It was full of scattered fires. Most went out before anyone found them. In the end, this is not a story about percentages. It is a story about proximity. Who found whom? Which corridors stayed open long enough? Which networks held through one more catastrophic winter? and which quietly fragmented before anyone else ever knew they existed. The founding group that carried Neanderthal DNA into every non-African human alive today may have numbered only in the low thousands. One window, a few generations wide, in a single corridor, roughly 47,000 years ago. Everything that followed, every language, every civilization, every genome ever sequenced passes through that bottleneck. Through a collision between two groups of humans who were both, in different ways, running out of options. The early modern Europeans at Ranis carried Neanderthal DNA. They left no direct descendants. They dissolved into later populations we haven't fully found yet. The ones who gave rise to us moved through that same darkness and somehow held together when others didn't. We are what remained after all of that erosion. And the systems holding us together now, food networks, energy grids, migration corridors, the reproductive redundancy we call civilization are not, in any deep evolutionary sense, more permanent than the ones that failed silently in an Ice Age world. We only see the survivors. We cannot see how close the margin was. That is what ancient DNA is truly telling us. Not that we won, but that we almost didn't over and over again, in ways the record will never fully give back. And the thing that kept any of us going, across every bottleneck and every collapse, was never strength. It was finding someone else before the fire went out. Subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, not for certainty, for the shadows still moving at the edge of everything we think we know.